familiar with the comment that we say in the Seder, Chayav Adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa miMitzrayim, that everyone is obligated to see themselves as if they have gone out of Egypt. And when my wife was alive, so every year I used to always quip that with all the Pesach cleaning that we're doing before Pesach, that I really experience what it means to be enslaved. And so that any opportunity I have to get away from the cleaning is really an opportunity to experience going from slavery to freedom. So I'm happy to be affording at least some of you that opportunity at this moment so that you can have a change of pace and be able to perhaps get out of the misery of doing, and it's even not even Pesach cleaning, it's spring cleaning. So in any case, what I'd like to do today is to examine the idea of freedom as we see it being expressed in the Jewish people as they are leaving Egypt, or even before they leave Egypt. And for the people who've been with me since we began Parshat Shmot, so I think this will actually bring together a number of things which I've been discussing over the past 10 weeks. And for those of you who haven't been with me, so it'll be independent and you can see this as a shiur on its own standing. So what I would like to begin with is actually the 9th plague, the plague of darkness, with a pasuk, which I'm sure a verse that everybody's familiar with. And Simon has posted a source sheet, which I attached. Again, you can follow along in that if you want. If not, I will be quoting whatever I have and you could see it later on. So we'll be starting with chapter 10 in Shmot. We'll start with verse 21, which is essentially the plague of darkness, where God instructs Moshe to send forth his hand and that there will be darkness on the land of Egypt. And then we're told how Moshe sends forth his hand. For 3 days there is darkness, where a man did not see his fellow. And not only that, for another 3 days, at least this is one interpretation. Not only were they not able to see, they weren't able to get up. But what interests me is, Ulechol b'nei Yisrael haya or b'moshvotam. And for all the Jewish people, there was light wherever they were. And this pasuk becomes really very, very important. And during Parshat Shavua, I think that I mentioned that, in fact, what you find regarding the plagues is that there's this constant process of essentially unraveling creation to the point where the end of the plagues are in darkness. It's as if Egypt is being brought back to a primordial state. And this then sets the stage for a new creation process, which is in effect the creation of the Jewish people. And in the same way, at the beginning of the creation story in chapter 1 of Genesis, the first thing which we have is the creation of light. So here we are now told about the light which the Jewish people experience. Now, I'm bringing this up because on the one hand, you could just look at it at face value and say, okay, the Egyptians are in darkness, the Jewish people are in light. And this, in a certain sense, parallels what we find in quite a few of the plagues of this separation that's being made between the Jewish people and the Egyptians. But on the other hand, there's something which is very important that's happening over here, which is, this is the first time, perhaps, where the Jewish people are beginning the process of actually going from slavery to freedom, where the Jewish people are what I might call active participants in their redemption process. And what I would like to actually begin with, which I think I mentioned in one of our sessions, but if I didn't, it's certainly worth mentioning, is a kind of definition of at least from my perspective, of what does it mean to really be free? And perhaps the motivation for this question is something which is perhaps troubling to some people. And if not troubling, at least, it would seem to be kind of ironic that we speak about the Jewish people during the Exodus going from slavery to freedom, but in effect, what they're really doing is substituting one master for another master, which means when they were in Egypt, we were slaves to Pharaoh. When we left Egypt, we became the servants of God, or one could say the slaves of God. All of a sudden, we were given the Mitzvot at Mount Sinai, but what does it mean to say that we went from slavery to freedom when in effect we actually substituted one master for another master? And it really has to do at its core with what is freedom. And so I think I mentioned, but if not, now it's worth saying it, that freedom is not necessarily the fact that I am free in an absolute sense, but freedom really has to do with the degree to which I am able to actualize my human dignity. The more that I'm able to actualize human dignity, I am in a state of freedom. Our sessions that this has been an ongoing challenge. In any case, if I can come back for a moment, what I was saying is Pharaoh's rule over the Jewish people involved a constant process of dehumanizing them. And where I left off was in chapter 6, in the beginning of chapter 6, Parshat Va'era, when Moshe brings this beautiful speech of redemption to the Jewish people. The response of the Jewish people is that they could not even hear Moshe because of the fact of what's called kotzer ruach, shortness of spirit, vavodah kasha, and harsh labor. Okay, this is, I think, verse 9 in chapter 6 in Shemot. So what you see is that this is the stage which the Jewish people have been brought to, that they are what you could call the living dead or the dead living, people who go through the motions of living, but are really dead in their spirit. The flip side of the coin is that God becoming the ruler of the Jewish people is meant to actually empower them, to give them all the tools to become the best people they can possibly be, to allow them to achieve their human grandeur, their majesty. And this is something that we've discussed over the course of the last few weeks. So therefore, the question which I'm dealing with is, what is the process that the Jewish people do to have that dignity? And what are the different elements in terms of what we could call the dignity of a human being, which is an expression of freedom? And so therefore, if I come back to how we began, in the plague of darkness, the Egyptian people are in darkness, the Jewish people have light. The tables have now been turned. The Egyptians now are experiencing what it means to be vulnerable. the Jewish people, because they can see, now have the power. And then the question is, what do the Jewish people do? And on my sheet, I actually quoted a very interesting midrash, which says, and this is number 2, that when the Jewish people had light wherever they were, the Jewish people would now go into the homes of the Egyptians, and they would actually take whatever they had, and the Egyptians didn't even realize that they were being, quote unquote, robbed. And according to this midrash, God is signaling to the Jewish people that in the future they will also go out of darkness to light, and the Egyptians will not react. The Egyptians will be silent. The fact is that this midrash is actually very disturbing, because in effect what it's saying is that when the Jewish people are now being put in a position where they have the power, they are now taking advantage of that power. They are now emptying out the Egyptian homes. What's even more so, though, is that it then creates a little bit of a problem with something which we see not only later on, but in fact at the very beginning, when Moshe is negotiating with God at the burning bush. And that is, if you look at reference number 3, which I have, this is from Shemot, chapter 3. This is chapter 3, excuse me, verse 21, 22. God says, I will place the favor of the Jewish people in the eyes of the Egyptians. When they go out of Egypt, they will not go out empty-handed. But a woman will ask her neighbor and from the person with whom she's living, utensils of silver, utensils of gold, and clothing. And they will put it on their children, on their sons and their daughters. And then there's the expression, v'nitzaltem et Mitzrayim, which in modern Hebrew would mean, and you will exploit Egypt. Okay, maybe I'll come back to that in 1 second. But the point which I want to make is that God already at the burning bush tells Moshe that the Jewish people will ask their neighbors for utensils of silver, utensils of gold, and clothing before they go out. And over there, the explanation is given so that they should not go out empty-handed. Which means, and maybe before I get to what it means, let's now look at chapter 11, which is the next source that I have. Chapter 11, verse 2. This is after Pharaoh calls Moshe in after the 9th plague and wants him to, and tells him that he can go, but with limitations. And Moshe refuses. And then God says to Moshe, there's one more plague that I'm about to bring. And he says this to Moshe while he's still in Pharaoh's palace. And then he says to him, tell the Jewish people what we saw a moment ago, that they should ask their neighbors for silver utensils, for gold utensils. And we're told, and God placed the favor of the Jewish people in the eyes of the Egyptians, which means that the Jewish people are actually told to ask the people for utensils, not to take it. And therefore, this verse, I think, presents a problem for that midrash. And in fact, you have other midrashim, and I quoted one, which says that the Jewish people did not actually take any of the utensils. They went around in the houses. They saw what was there. And when the time came for them to take it, they would come to the Egyptians and said, could you give us something? And the Egyptians would say, well, we really don't have it. And then the Jews would say to them, oh, by the way, I know where it is. It's right over there. Could you please give it to us? Now, what I want to bring up with this is the following. if I go by the pshat of the psukim, when there was darkness, when the Egyptians were totally vulnerable, the Jewish people had quite a few options which they could have exercised. They could have just picked up and left during the time of darkness, okay, and gotten far enough away where Pharaoh would have no clue where they were. They could have done another thing. They could have actually taken advantage and slaughtered all the Egyptians because the Egyptians couldn't see them and they couldn't have done anything. Minimally, as this one midrash says, they could have completely emptied out, right, everything which was in the Egyptian homes. But they didn't. They didn't exercise any of these options. And the reason why they didn't do it is because this was a very important lesson in perhaps what it means to be free. When you have the power, when you have the advantage, how do you then act to those people who are now in your hands and totally powerless? And in this situation, the dignity of the Jewish people is actually reflected through their self-restraint. To not do what the other side would have done to them, to behave differently. As if to say, we're not like you. We have a different standard by which we behave. And on the other hand, God told the Jewish people to ask them for clothing because it was very important for them to not go out empty-handed. Today we would call this severance pay. We might call it reparations. But the idea being that somehow the Jewish people need to be given the means to be able to, in fact, be independent, to be able to actualize their aspirations. And the Torah at the burning bush said, God prefaces by saying, when the Jewish people will go out, they will not go out empty-handed. Because it's important that when they go out with a sense, we are now free. We now have dignity. We have the means to be able to now create a new life. And by the way, I'll just say parenthetically, the clothing becomes very important. Because what you wear to a certain extent becomes an expression of who you are. By changing your clothes, it's a way of saying, I am now putting behind my old life, assuming a new persona. And I will just add at this point, this idea of the Jewish people going out with the means to create a new life actually becomes a law later on in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 15. Chapter 15, verse 13 and 14. When the Jewish people are told, if you have a Hebrew slave, for 6 years he will work, in the 7th year he will be sent away, sent free. But when you send them free, do not send them empty-handed. The same exact expression which was used in chapter 3 of Shmot at the burning bush. Which means, to a certain extent, what the Jewish people experienced in Egypt becomes the model for how they should treat those people who are their slaves, even though technically they're not really slaves. And by the way, this becomes, I think, an important basis for what we're all familiar with today, which I said, severance pay. Someone leaves their job, they get a certain amount of money, which is now going to enable them to then make that transition to the next stage. Severance pay. So this becomes perhaps the first component. Number one, when I have the means and I have the power to not take advantage of it, to not become like the one who is my oppressor. And number two, how important it is that when I make that transition from slavery to freedom, that I actually have the means to be able to make that transition. But I want to bring up another point, and that is it's not only that God gave them the means to go out, but they had to ask. And the fact that they had to ask is very important, because it means that they have to be able to have the resolve, to have the nerve, or maybe just to have the confidence to go to their oppressor and to confront them and to ask them for what, in fact, is actually due to them. And we all know how difficult it is for somebody who's in a position of inferiority to confront their superior and to have to somehow ask for something, knowing very well that they could be refused. So that's where, to a certain extent, it takes courage to be able to stand up, to ask for what's really perhaps coming to you. And this is why, as I said, from the end of chapter 10, going through chapter 11 is only a few verses, but essentially what we're going to get to now, chapter 12, the Jewish people have to now take hold of themselves. They have to play an active role in their redemption. They have to now somehow demonstrate that they are free. By the way, I just want to point out what appears at the end of chapter 12, and it's on reference number 3. After we're told about Pharaoh finally agreeing to let the Jewish people go and giving them the green light, and how the Jewish people are in haste to leave Egypt. In chapter 12, verse 35, it says, "And the Jewish people did according to what Moshe said, and they asked the Egyptians for utensils of silver and gold, and God put their favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and they asked them." And I'm sorry, vayash ilum, that was a big mistake. Not that they asked them, but that the Egyptians gave to them what they asked. Now, I want to point out something which is, a small grammatical point, but actually becomes very important in this section. When it says the Jewish people did what Moshe said, it doesn't mean that they did it as they're on their way out of Egypt. After they've now gone through what we'll see in a moment, the First Seder, after Pharaoh has finally given them the approval, after they're baking their bread and making it matzah because they have to rush out. A number of commentaries say that rather than saying, "and the Jewish people did," you should read it, "the Jewish people had done." Because generally in the narrative, we put the vav in front of the verb. And what it should have said in the Hebrew is, "Vayasu b'nei Israel," which would have meant that we're now doing things in chronological sequence. By switching that literary form and putting the vav in front of the subject, that's telling me that what we're doing now is making this into a past perfect. Now, why is this important? Because the Jewish people actually asked them for these things before chapter 12. And as we're going to see in a moment, in chapter 12, when they're told to be fully dressed and ready to go, they're fully dressed with those garments that the Egyptians already gave them. So it's very important to note that the Jewish people actually did what they were told to do. They had the courage to ask for the clothing and the silver and gold. And not only that, but they did it before they actually experienced their Seder. So that at the Seder, they are wearing the garments of freedom. Now, I just want to make one comment, and I'm sure this could be the basis of a whole long discussion. And but I'm not going to I'm not going to digress on this. When it says that the Jewish people vayiнаtslu, which in modern Hebrew would mean they exploited the Egyptians, okay, I think that there's another way that you could read it, that the nun is actually a kind of passive form of what would be lahatzil, which means to save. And then the way that I would read it is that the Jewish people actually enabled the Egyptians to be saved, which means on a certain level, by the Jewish people accepting these severance, reparations from the Egyptians, that was in a certain sense part of an atonement process for the Egyptians. It was part of, one might even say, a healing process in the relations between the Jews and the Egyptians. But I realize this can certainly be open for debate. But what I'm trying to suggest over here is how it's very important for the Jewish people to start going through a process of empowering themselves, actualizing their dignity, and becoming free through all that. And this is where we get to now chapter 12, which is essentially what I'd like to focus on tonight, which is the first Seder of the Jewish people. And again, I want to emphasize, when the Jewish people have their first Seder, they are actually experiencing freedom even before they've actually been given the green light by Pharaoh to become free. Which says a lot in terms of what does it mean to be free. Even in Egypt, even when technically they are still slaves, they can actually experience freedom. And so let's begin with chapter 12. And this appears on my source sheet, but you don't need it because you have your Tanachim, I'm sure. So let's look at the beginning of chapter 12. And God said to Moses and Aaron in the Egypt, verse 2, HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim, this month shall now be to you the first of the new months, the Chodshei Hashanah, for the months of the year. And I'll just point out that the word Chodesh can mean month. The word Chodesh can also mean Rosh Chodesh, the first day of the month. Okay, for those of you who are familiar, in the book of Samuel, there is a very famous haftarah which we read whenever Rosh Chodesh comes out on Sunday. And that haftarah is called Machar Chodesh. So that the word Chodesh can actually mean not just the month, but the first of the month. And this is just a very interesting phenomenon in Hebrew that, although I should say that it could be in other languages as well, the word day can mean a 24-hour period. Day can also mean daytime. And in fact, you see this in the chapter 1 in Genesis, right? God separated between day and night, where day means daytime, but then God called both day and night the first day. So that it's very interesting how there's a certain, when we talk about time, there's a certain unit of time which is a kind of microcosm of a larger unit, and perhaps essentially is expressing the essence of that. Now, over here, we're talking about this month will now be the first of the months of the year. And in effect, the quote unquote Jewish calendar really begins not on Rosh Hashanah, not on Tishrei, but the Jewish calendar in the Torah, in the Tanakh, actually begins with the month of Nisan. Because the month of Nisan is the beginning of Jewish peoplehood, the Jewish nation. And so we mark our time from the beginning of this month. But I just want to point out, if you actually look in chapter 2 in Shemot, you'll see that after Moshe is born, his mother hides him for a period of 3 months. And the word that's used over there is Shlosha Yirachim, 3 moons. And we're familiar with, perhaps in modern Hebrew, that the word for a month is Chodesh. But in fact, in the Tanakh, the word can also be moon, which makes a lot of sense because the calendar is based on the moon. But the fact that over here, the Torah chose to use the word Chodesh rather than Yerachim as it does in chapter 2 is very significant. Because Chodesh is related to the word Chadash, which means new. And it has to do with the phenomenon of how every month, right, we have a renewal of the moon. And not only that, but there's a whole process that the moon goes through, right, from its inception to its maximal point. And the fact that the first commandment, which is given to the Jewish people, is the sanctification of the new moon, Kiddush HaChodesh. But what I might also say as a play on words, Kiddush HaChadash, the sanctification of the new. Maybe this is the first mitzvah, which is also a very important statement in terms of freedom. And that is time consciousness, and a particular type of time consciousness. Many, many years ago, I was at a shir that Rabbi Soloveitchik gave before Pesach, talking about the Haggadah. And he essentially said that perhaps the most fundamental element which characterizes a free person is time awareness. He said slaves don't have an awareness of time. And what does that mean in simple terms? If you're a slave to someone, your time is not your own. And therefore, it really doesn't matter what you do with your time because it's not yours. Hypothetically, if you finish your job quickly, it's not then going to be your choice as to what you do with the extra time on your hands. That's up to your master. And if that's the case, you also don't have any motivation necessarily for finishing quickly. Because why should you do that? Because in the end, you'll just have to do even more work for someone else. And you don't gain from it. Which means the idea of valuing time is something which is characteristic of a free person. And perhaps that's the first thing I think that's very important. How much do we value time? How much do we realize the importance of our time, the need to structure our time, to maximize our time? I'll just bring up something which I'm sure everybody has said at one point or another, right? You're sitting around waiting for a bus, and you know that you have another 20 minutes for the bus to come, and you say, well, I have 20 minutes to kill. I'm sure people have said that before. And the question is, how much do people realize what they're saying? you're killing time. And maybe you shouldn't be killing the time, because maybe every moment is precious. And unfortunately, I think, we sometimes realize that all too often, how much maybe, the time went and we didn't maximize what we could have gotten out of that time. So therefore, the first mitzvah, which is given to the Jewish people, is a sense of the importance of time. And how, if we're going to be a free people, we know how to use our time. But it's not only the importance of time and how to use it. The first thing, which I think is hachodesh hazeh, chidush, the fact that every moment is new, the fact that every moment is dynamic, the fact that things can change dramatically. And perhaps this is something which sets the difference between someone who's a slave and someone who's free. A slave is somebody who goes through the same motions day in, day out, who doesn't have anything to look forward to. A free person is somebody who realizes that at any moment, right, it's within their capacity to do whatever it is with their time. And every moment can then mark a dramatic change. If you have this appreciation of how time is something which can bring about dramatic changes, something new can happen, it's exciting, it's exhilarating. It also gives people optimism. It motivates them, gives them hope. It enables them to really live their lives. And that's what it means to be free. I can imagine that there are people, right? I don't know if in this audience, but in other places, right? Who sometimes have a hard time getting up in the morning for whatever reason. Like, what's the point? I just want to sleep in. Could be because you had a hard day before. It could be you're going through a crisis. But there's a problem with that. And in a certain sense, it means you're kind of enslaved to a situation you find yourself in. To what extent is it that, you wake up, it's a new day, it's exciting, the sun is shining, what can I do? That's the idea of hachodesh hazeh lachem. The idea that, yes, yesterday you were slaves, but today it's going to be different. There's hope. There's the possibility of seeing something, but it's now within your hands to make that happen. And then what we find is what I would call a very nuanced sense of time that comes about through this whole chapter. The Jewish people are given a timetable, a schedule, which is outlining the process of what's about to happen that's going to bring about their exodus. So they're told in verse 3, Dabru al kol adat b'nei Yisrael be'asor lachodesh hazeh, on the 10th day of this month, that they should take the sheep. And then if I skip for a moment, in verse 6, and you will guard it, you will watch it until the 14th day. And then subsequently, what we're told is, you will then slaughter it on the 14th day in the afternoon. And then if I go to verse 8, and then you will eat the meat that night. And then eventually what we're told is how the Jewish people will then come out of Egypt. But they're given a very clear set of goals. On the 10th day, take the sheep. On the 14th day, you'll slaughter it in the afternoon. At night, you will then go ahead and eat it. Having a schedule, having a goal, is again the mark of a free person. The idea that I am now going to actually be accomplishing something, but not only accomplishing something which is now leading me on the road to what eventually will be my freedom. So that when you see that you have a goal that you're going to achieve, again, that's something which is very exciting. It motivates you. But you also have a schedule. You have to live within that schedule. Now let's look at another few elements which come up that have to do with time. The Jewish people are told in verse 8 that they will eat the meat that night, sli'esh umatzot, roasted. And they're told explicitly in the next verse, do not eat it raw, do not cook it in water, but only roasted. In total, you should roast it. Why roast it instead of cooking it? So for the moment, I just want to say they're doing that because roasting is much quicker than cooking. And we want it to go quickly. Why do we want it to go quickly? Well, this fits in with what we find in verse 11. Because it says, and so shall you eat it. Motnechem chagurim, your loins are girded. Nalechem beraglechem, your shoes are on your feet. Makelchem biyedchem, your staff is in your hand. V'achaltem oto b'chipazon, you'll eat it quickly. Pesach hu Lashem, you have to be eating it quickly. Why? This is a Pesach to God. Now, why do they have to eat it quickly? Well, you might say, you have to, and why do they have to be all dressed and ready to go? So you'll say, because it may very well be that they have to be ready to go at a moment's notice when Pharaoh gives them the okay. But actually, that's not true. Because it says, if I go back for a second, it says in, let me just find it. Okay, I'll find it in 1 second. So let me just go to my next point and I'll come back. I mean, where the verse which I'm looking for, I just have to find it, is where God says to them, but don't leave your houses the whole night. So that this leads us to the second point, which is that on the one hand, they have to be very quick. And on the other hand, they also have to take their time. And they're not allowed to leave in the middle of the night. And even though, if we look at verse 31 in this section, Pharaoh calls Moshe in the middle of the night and says, get up and go. The Jewish people don't leave in the middle of the night. But the Jewish people only leave the following day. As we're told in verse 51, Vayihi be'etzem hayom hazeh, in the midst of that day, that the Jewish people actually, God took the Jewish people out of Egypt. So if they're not going to leave during the middle of the night, then why do they have to be all dressed and everything else? Well, the simple way of taking it is, and why do they have to hurry? Well, they have to hurry because they have to eat the Korban Pesach, the Paschal lamb, before midnight. Before God is going to bring about the plague of the firstborn. And it's as if these are two sides of the coin to what will then be the redemption process of the Jewish people. On the one hand, the Jewish people have to do this service of God. When they do the service of God as they were directed to do, then God will complete their redemption by bringing about the plague of the firstborn. Why do they have to be fully dressed? Because those are what I said earlier, the garments of their freedom. Which means that the Jewish people, when they are now eating the Korban Pesach, are now demonstrating their freedom, are now redeeming themselves. And once they've done everything which they can do, God then completes the process. The Jewish people have to take the Korban Pesach on the 10th of the month, but they have to wait until the 14th day before they slaughter it. Well, wait a second, but if you're not going to slaughter it till the 14th, why are you taking it on the 10th? We're going to come to that in 1 second. But what I'm trying to demonstrate over here is a time consciousness, which means that on the one hand, to be very, very what we would call diligent, to be very quick, to have a schedule, to stick to that schedule, and yet at the same time to be able to also take a deep breath and to be able to wait for when it's appropriate to finally do it. And now I want to add, by the way, this idea of also being quick comes up later on in the section when it talks about guarding the Matsuot. Okay, if you look in verse 17, it says, Ushmartem et hamatzot, you should guard the matzot. What are you guarding it? So that the time doesn't go by and then the matzah will become bread, which we don't want to happen. So there's this idea of being quick, and there's the idea of also being able to hold back. But there's a third element which comes up here also, and that is the idea of what I'm doing has implications for generations. And what I'm doing will then be commemorated in future generations. So that it's not just what is going to be relevant for this moment, but to realize how this will impact forever. By the way, I'll just say parenthetically, what I'm talking about in terms of this time consciousness actually is very much relevant to this week's Parshat Tzav, when it's talking about the sacrifices in the tabernacle, in the temple, from the perspective of the priests. And I mentioned in another podcast that the Parsha is all about the priests. And the Parsha is called Parshat Tzav. And Tzav is a commandment. And Rashi makes the comment, Tzav, based on a rabbinic comment, is miyad uledorot. The idea being that what you're doing is very important for the moment, but also has implications for generations. So to come back to our section, what does it mean to be a free person? To be a free person means that I take my time seriously. I maximize the usage of my time. I don't sit around and dawdle and loiter, but I want to get it done because I have something which is very important that I want to accomplish. So that the first thing is I'm diligent and I stick to my schedule. But I'm also somebody who knows not to jump the gun, to be able to wait for the right moment to do whatever is needed to be done. There is a time to take the lamb. There's a time to slaughter the lamb. There's a time to eat the lamb. And each one has to be done in its proper time. There's a time for me to get myself fully dressed, but I then have to wait until I'm given the go-ahead to finally go out. When Pharaoh comes to Moshe and says to him, okay, you can now leave, go. Moshe's response is, we're not going to go when you tell us to go. We're going to go when we want to go. We're not going to leave in the middle of the night like thieves who are running away. We're going to leave in the middle of the day where we see where we're going, where we're in full view of everyone, where we're not intimidated by anyone, where we are going to leave with our heads held high. That's the mark of a free person. Now let's come back to the other point, which is it's not only a question of knowing how to balance when to act, when not to act, but to also realize how what I do may have implications far beyond this moment, maybe even for generations. People speak about it a lot without even getting into, I don't want to get into the politics, but I'm just illustrating it. When Netanyahu was very opposed to the Iranian deal, one of the statements which he made was, if we go and do this deal too quickly, and if we don't really think it through, and we don't wait, and we don't really get the best deal, this is going to have implications for generations, not just for right now. And again, without getting into the politics, whether you're for or against it, but the idea that someone is now aware that what I'm doing is not just about what's going to happen right now, but this may have implications far beyond me. That's a very important statement. And this then gets me into another point, which is an awareness of time is also an awareness of history, an awareness of a past, which also gives me a sense of a future. And that becomes a major theme in chapter 12 as well. It's important for the Jewish people who right now are in the middle of slavery to be looking towards future generations when they will not be enslaved, when they will be coming into the land of Israel, and to actually see that this is a reality. And not only to look at the future, but throughout, before this already, the Jewish people were made aware of their past, of the promise which God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that although they will be enslaved in Egypt, that they will eventually be taken out of Egypt. So that part of being a free person is also not just, how do I behave at this moment in time, but to also ask myself, how does that fit in with my past, with my future? So this is the first thing which we find over here, the sense of time consciousness. But the time consciousness is also very much connected with the Korban Pesach. At the first Seder which the Jewish people have, the focus of their Seder is the Korban Pesach, the lamb. And now I want to focus on this idea of taking the lamb on the 10th day, but not slaughtering it until the 14th day. And for those of you who have Rashi, right, reference number 10, Rashi makes the comment, why did they have to take the lamb on the 10th and then slaughter it on the 14th? So what it says over here is that, well, God gave the Jewish, when the time came for the Jewish people to be redeemed from Egypt, they didn't have any mitzvot at their disposal. So God, in effect, gave them two mitzvot. God gave them the mitzvah Brit Milah and the mitzvah of the Korban Pesach. And this is based on a verse from Ezekiel, which we say every time at a Brit Milah, B'damai yechayi, with your bloods you shall live. Two bloods, the blood of the circumcision and the blood of the Korban Pesach. And it's on the basis of these two mitzvot, which the Jewish people did, that they were then redeemed from Egypt. And according to this midrash, the 10th day was the day where they did the Brit Milah. But they had to wait 3 days until they then did the Korban Pesach. And that was the combination of the two bloods. But there's another element which Rashi brings up, which is, and I have this in bold print, he says, because the Jewish people were steeped in idolatry, God then said to them, Mishchu ukechu lachem, pull and take to you this lamb. Okay, and this is in fact what we find in verse, let me just find it, in verse 21, chapter 12, 21, when Moshe speaks to the elders, he says, Mishchu kechu, which is an unusual expression. And according to the Midrash, it says, pull your hands from idolatry and take the Lamb of Mitzvah. So this is what I want to now focus on for the last minutes that we have, and I realize I'll be, as always, a few minutes overboard. For the Jewish people, there is the need for them to define for themselves, who are they really? And the Korban Pesach is becoming the litmus test. Are you part of Egyptian culture, or are you prepared to be part of a different culture, which is serving God? And the test will be, are you prepared to now take this animal, slaughter this animal, because this animal is held sacred. This animal is a god in Egyptian culture. By you slaughtering this animal, it's a way of making a statement to yourselves that what is held sacred in Egypt, you are now slaughtering. You are cutting yourself off from that. You are now entering a different type of experience. So that for the Jewish people, and I think this is true for them as a free people, they have to now make a conscious choice of identity. Who am I? What do I identify with? What are the values? Do I identify with what Egypt holds as its values, or with something else? And I think this point actually becomes very important, because it's not only the Jewish people being freed from the physical enslavement by Pharaoh, but there's also, according to this midrash, a spiritual enslavement. The Jews have very much become part of Egyptian society and culture. Can they break from that and become their own people? And the litmus test is the Korban Pesach. If they are able to slaughter it, take the blood, put it on the doorposts and on the lintel, it's now going to be a sign to you, a sign of this, your home. It's not an Egyptian home, it's a Jewish home. Are you prepared to now make that shift? And I want to add one other element to that, which is the 4-day gap. Why take that animal, wait 4 days? Because it's a test of faith. If in fact this animal is sacred to the Egyptians, And the Egyptians know that the Jewish people are now about to slaughter it. Well, the Egyptians are not just going to stand by. They might actually kill the Jewish people for killing their God. Are the Jewish people prepared to now confront the Egyptians? Or are they going to be afraid and as a result will then back down from slaughtering this animal, even if they don't identify with that, but they're just not prepared to put their lives on the line? And how do I know that this is in fact life-threatening? Because if you look at the last reference which I have, in the fourth plague, this is in chapter 8, verse 21, in the fourth plague of Arov, when Pharaoh is, after the plague has come, negotiating with Moses, and Pharaoh says to him, well, why do you have to go out into the desert and serve your God? Why not do it inside the land of Egypt? And Moshe's response in verse 22 is, it's not appropriate for us to do this. It's an abomination to Egypt for us to be sacrificing their God. How could we possibly be sacrificing their God in front of their eyes and they won't kill us? So here's Moshe saying, for us to be sacrificing this animal in front of the Egyptians, that's a death sentence on us. And the irony is that's exactly what God tells the Jewish people to do before they leave. To demonstrate what is it that they identify with and how much are they prepared to put their lives on the line. By taking 4 days, the Jewish people have to live with the agony that at any moment an Egyptian could be breaking into their homes and killing them for what they're about to do, because what they're doing is not a secret, it's common knowledge. By putting the blood on the doorposts, and here there's a disagreement among the rabbis of the Mishnah. Did they put the blood on the inside or did they put it on the outside? Who is this meant to be a sign to? Is it a sign to the Jewish people? Is it, in a certain sense, a demonstrative act, a statement to the Egyptians? And I think in true Jewish fashion, it's both. I really believe it was put on the inside and put on the outside. Because first of all, it's a statement for the Jewish people to be looking at themselves and saying, who am I? But then it's a way of the Jewish people also being ready to say to the Egyptians, this is who I am and I'm not prepared to hide it. And I am prepared to even die as a free person rather than to continue living as a slave. And it's that statement which has to be done before midnight, which is ultimately what then allows God to reinforce and to then bring about the plague of the firstborn, which then is instrumental in bringing about the exodus of the Jewish people. So that I'll just end with saying that to be a free person is also to ask myself, who am I? And when I say, who am I, to then say, well, if this is who I am, how do I then maximize that? What are the things that I believe in? What are the things that I believe in so much that I'm prepared to even give up my life for them? What are those values that in the end, I want to then hand down to the generations to come? And in my mind, that's not something which is easy. That's something which, in fact, is very difficult. And especially today, we talk about how people have multiple identities and how do you balance multiple identities. And how much are you prepared to actually stand up for those identities? That's a very, very serious question, but it's at the core of what it means to be a free person. If I'm free, then it means that I should be able to maximize who I am, what I believe in, because that's my dignity. You'll give me one more second. I'm sorry to just throw this in, but I can't not say it. For us as Jews, a major statement at the Seder night is what it is to be part of the Jewish people, to come together as the Jewish people. And something which I think is also very important to think is it's not only a question of who am I as an individual? What does it mean for me to be free and to have dignity as an individual? But how is my dignity expressed as being part of a people? With the realization that being part of a people is, number one, empowering those around me, but also by being part of that people, becoming empowered. And being part of the Jewish people, as I mentioned before, is not just my community, not just Jews around the world, but the totality of Jewish history. And that, I think, is something very serious for us to think about on the Seder night. Those are the multiple identities that we have. And how do we find that expression? And to begin thinking about how can we maximize ourselves as individuals? How do we fit into a much larger scheme of being part of the Jewish people and being part of the Jewish people for all generations? Thank you very much, everyone.